We'd already said that with the southeast, we based our expansion upon tribal removal. Southwest was annexation and conquest. Now let's specifically discuss that annexation and conquest. It begins with Texas. Now Texas originally, as you can see on the map, Texas originally is not only bordering to Mexico, Texas is part of Mexico. This is all part of the Mexican nation state, which had declared its independence from Spain in 1821. So as a nation state, it's truly vast. It goes all the way down underneath my map into the Yucatan Peninsula and all the way down almost towards Central America, and then all the way up here, vast potential for resources, vast potential for development. However, the northern provinces of Mexico were all underpopulated. They were all essentially, as they'd been for many, many centuries, there weren't a whole lot of people there developing these regions. So for the government of the newly established nation of Mexico, having people settle these areas is important because by settling them, these regions can be developed. And this is the impetus or spur which leads the Mexican government to establish what is known as the impresario system. In 1825, it's a Mexican system that offers large land grants to what were called impresarios, leaders of large bands of settlers, if they imported families into Texas. Unfortunately for the state of Mexico, be careful what you wish for, because the people they received, the draw coming into this area, wound up being Americans who were looking for new land to expand into to extend that southern plantation crop monoculture system. It didn't draw people from the south north as much as it drew people from the east west. And be careful what you wish for. And this is where that gets played out for Mexico quite clearly. By 1830, there were 20,000 Americans, because this immigration encouragement policy, there were 20,000 Americans, along with 5,000 there of black slaves living in Mexico. There were only 4,000 actual Mexican nationals living in Mexico. So when this resident guest population, whom by the way are almost all Protestants, they're not Catholic as the Mexican state was, which it inherited from the Spanish government it had been under during its founding. This nation state doesn't, nation of Texas, or the nation of Mexico rather, and these American immigrants coming in who called themselves Texicans, like Texas Americans, didn't really see themselves as even wanting to assimilate into Mexican culture. They wanted to replicate and bring their own American culture over, and ultimately, in many ways, they identified more with that United States government and sought to make themselves part of that United States government. They saw that as being a long-term, long-distance goal. It's not even so much of a conspiracy as much as it's just a long-standing, foregone conclusion that was going to take place. So you've got these cultural and religious frictions as the Americans retain their cultural habits, retain black slavery, which the Mexican government disapproved of, retained their Protestantism as opposed to converting to Roman Catholicism. And it led to tensions and frictions which finally exploded in 1835 in the famous Texas War of Independence. In this war, of course, you've got the Alamo, you've got the martyrdom of Travis and Bowie and Crockett at the Alamo, you've got Sam Houston rising up as a military leader at Battle of San Jacinto, things you've read about and learned about in your own history courses. And long story short, Texas achieves their independence by 1836. They defeat the dictator Santa Anna, who runs the Mexican government, forcing him to sign a treaty of independence, ceding and giving Texas their independence. As soon as he got free, Santa Anna said, I signed it under duress, so it's really not legal. But in any event, he wasn't in a position to militarily take these territories back at this point in time. Texas immediately pivots and turns to the United States and asks for annexation. Can we become part of the United States? Jackson, who was president during this time, it's the last part of his term, says no. Refuses to allow them to come to the United States. Not because he didn't want Texas. Jackson would have seen Texas as being a good asset. But as I said, or as has been mentioned in your previous lesson, we're at the end of an era. There's new priorities taking a hold now in the place of the old priorities, the Jacksonian era, which was dealing with the bank and dealing with Indian removal and dealing with tariff and nullification crises. The new crises are going to involve crises of economics, politics, and race. Had Texas entered the Union, it would have upset the balance of slave and free states, the balance that had been sort of held in place since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, where states had entered the Union in twos, free state, slave state. To admit Texas would have upset this balance, and that also would have upset the North, as seeing this as being a slave conspiracy to grab an enormous chunk of land. A vast, look at that big pink area on the map there, a vast chunk of land for slave state usage, which would have overwhelmed the size of any free state that was even going to be coming into the Union in the near future. So anticipating Northern resistance to slavery, Jackson defers. He declines to admit Texas, which is why for 9 years, Texas exists haltingly as its own independent nation. It's the only state in the Union to ever have a pre-existing condition as an independent country prior to annexation by the United States. So that solves our Texas problem in the Southwest temporarily, at least for the Texicans. They don't quite have what they want, but it also has evicted Mexico from the immediate southern border of the United States for the present. On to Oregon, as we talked about earlier on some previous slides, there were competing claims to Oregon. James K. Polk runs for president in 1844 on a campaign platform of 54-40 or fight. And what he means by that is, if you look closely enough at my maps, the 49th parallel is right here. It was the northern border of the United States between Britain and Canada. The 50th parallel is this line that we see right up there. And the Oregon Territory was an area that was sort of in disputed claim. There were multiple claimants to it. At one point in time, the Spanish had claim to it. At one point in time, the Russians had claim to it. At one point in time, that we're talking about now, it's mostly the British and Americans have claim to it. The Oregon Territory actually extends further up my map. The full territory went almost up to where Alaska would be on the map over there, this whole swath of territory, which gets up to roughly 54 degrees, 40 minutes northern latitude, okay? And so James K. Polk is running for president on the campaign promise of, if you elect me, I'm going to take all that. We're going to claim it all. If the British want to fight us for us, so be it. We're there. We're ready for it. So 54-40 or fight. Polk squeaks out a very narrow election victory, which really wasn't much of a mandate for expansion, but he interpreted it as one. He took it as one. Now, he's going to not really fight the British. We'll talk about what he does in the Southwest in a minute, but realpolitik, as we said earlier, he and the British discovered and determined that it might be a lot better to negotiate over this and maybe split this territory about even Steven, continuing that 49th parallel line. And the treaty line of 1846, they continue the 49th parallel line all the way to the ocean. Both sides could have fought one another over this. Both sides could have gone to war over this, but a cost-benefit analysis sort of told them in a realpolitik sense that it probably wasn't worth it. This is a more amicable solution to make, so it's the solution they do make. With the Southwest, the story will be a quite different matter. It'll be an entirely different story in the Southwest. You had all kinds of arguments both for and against American expansion to the Pacific during this time. One of the arguments for it would have been, you reduce the possibility or likelihood of collisions with foreign powers. You simply push them off the map and annex these lands and make them all American. You can spread democratic ideals, spread the blessings of American liberty to all these new territories. You can fulfill the mission of bringing, a superior civilization to these lawless or quote-unquote savage regions as Americans saw them during the time. You can improve the lands that Mexico held that wasn't using properly because they weren't able to develop it. And we can also acquire the benefits of a front porch on the Pacific Ocean, harbors and trade areas for the Far East. There's definitely arguments against expansion during this time. Among those arguments would be, who are we to force our institutions on the Mexicans? Who are we as the United States to say, we can just bully you and take this because we can? It's going to interfere with the rights of people to their own self-determination. There's people who live there who already have and want the government they have. We shouldn't take that away from them. There are those that argue in America that the Mexican War, if we expand, it's only a war to make more slave states. So it's a war to expand slavery, not liberty. And there are Americans who despise that, particularly in the North. Mexico is also not a threat to the United States. They weren't a danger to us, not like Spain was, not like France was when we bought Louisiana, not like Britain was when we compromised with the Treaty of 1846. And the war is, if there's going to be a war, maybe it's going to be an unconstitutional act because the president's got to make up a reason for one. So there's all kinds of reasons against expansion. It might reinforce racism. It might leave lasting bitterness. So you've got this mixed bag of American feeling on what to do about that. And much of the feelings on the war depended on where you lived, on your feelings for expansion and annexation into Mexico.